will this trigger be executed only when my, so will this function, let's call this as function for a second, will this function, that's a bad word, will this trigger be triggered, let's say, will this trigger be triggered if and only if I have a negative balance, or will it be triggered every time I make an update to the account table? Any answers? Only for negative balances or whenever I update? Every time, right? Because we have an if condition that executes conditionally, but this trigger will always be called every time. Exactly. Exactly. Okay. Trigger pitfalls. Okay. So certain things different vendors have different mechanisms for executing triggers. So for example, MySQL insert triggers would fire even if you have bulk insert statements, or if you have bulk if you are bulk loading data using insert statements from a backup file. However, MySQL delete triggers do not fire if you are deleting or truncating the table, right? So that is a feature about MySQL. So just the delete triggers are not fired at that point. Some other vendors might have different approaches to this problem. So you can say that some other vendors might not execute a trigger if you are bulk loading data from a file. It might not even execute a trigger then. You'd have to look into the manual of that particular database in order to figure out what they allow or they don't. MySQL does allow these things. So if a trigger for a commonly performed task, basically insert statement that is always performed or something like that, is very slow, that would actually kill your database performance as well. If a trigger has a bug in it, like an example that we saw earlier, if a trigger has a bug in it, and this is something that you guys will be able to play around in your assignment 4, but essentially, and that would be fun. But if a trigger has a bug in it, it may abort the changes that are made to the table, or it may just crash by making half a change depending upon how much your database supports transactions or not, right? And the other really nifty thing that might happen, and by nifty, I mean really horrible thing for you, but it might be a fun thing to test out. So if you are, so triggers can write to other tables. Those tables can also have triggers that do some stuff on other things as well. So you can imagine that it would be quite easy to create a loop of triggers, right? So me writing to a table, the trigger would actually execute something on another table. That table might execute something as a trigger on my table. So now essentially we have a loop. So it is not that difficult to actually create an infinite chain of triggering events, and your database just crashed, right? So you need to keep these in mind as well when you're implementing triggers. Um, as I said, we can also implement referential integrity with triggers. Basically, we can have basically on all inserts and updates, check the referencing table and ensure that the foreign key column is maintained and it is legitimate. If not, abort the operation. That would be, so what type of trigger would this be? Would this be a before trigger or an after trigger? So before insert, after insert, which one? If I'm trying to implement referential integrity for my tables, and I can say that on all inserts and updates to the referencing table, I need to ensure that the foreign key exists in that other table. Otherwise, I would just abort the operation if it does not exist. Would this be a before a trigger or an after trigger? I think it would be a before trigger, right? There is no point in doing it after. But even if you do it after, we can set it to all null values, but it would be better suited if we set it to before trigger. Okay. On all updates and delays to the reference table, you basically can ensure that it doesn't appear again in the referencing table as well. But again, this is definitely going to be slower than your standard mechanism. You will be able to play around a lot with triggers for your assignment 4, as I said, and I believe materialized views as well, but we'll talk about that later. But essentially, whenever, again, as I said, whenever a database gives you the ability to, gives you an inbuilt ability to do something, it is always better to use that because other options might become a bit slow. Blah blah blah. As I said, yeah, you can also use it to update your row version, your last modified timestamp. I talked about that. Mm, you can also maintain audit log, or you can also use a trigger to maintain a backup copy of a table, right? So you can say that whenever a data is inserted into my table, create a maintain a backup table where that data is also inserted into that table. Does everyone see how we can do that using a trigger? Right? Can we maintain? So answer me yes or no. Can we maintain like a backup database or a backup table using a trigger? That is, whenever something is inserted to this original table, a trigger is fired where that trigger essentially inserts the same data into a backup table as well. Right? It would be an easy thing to do. Does everyone get that? No? Yes? No idea? Well, we can have a trigger that is after insert or something, after insert on some account table. And essentially whatever we have as row for the new one, we can again basically insert this new row into a backup account table. Right? Exactly. We can access the individual values as new dot account number, new dot branch name, whatever's the new dot balance, and essentially add those three values into a backup table. Right? Every time we insert something in one table, it will automatically get inserted into the other table. Okay. Finally, we can also use triggers to sort of create summary tables, right? This is something you can, if you remember that this is also an extra credit part for your project. So essentially, you can also use triggers to create summary tables. So imagine the brand summary, imagine the account table, right? So we want, for each branch, we want a summary of that branch's total balances and that branch's total amount of loans. Well, we can easily get the values for that, essentially just group by the account IDs and then sum up all the balances, group by account IDs, sum up all the loans. And for that particular, sorry, group by the branch names, my bad, group by the branch names and sum up all the balances, group by the branch names and sum up all the loans for every account ID. And then essentially we can have a table that is just branch name, the total balance that the branch has, and the total amount of loan that branch has given out, right? So we can have a summary of all branches of our bank, and that would be sort of also possible to do in a trigger, right? Using a trigger. So every time a change is made to any branch or any entry is made to the account table, we can fire a trigger that updates this summary table with this new set of values. This also sort of looks like a view, but again, a view is essentially, remember, a query that needs to be executed again and again. It is not saving your result somewhere. A view is not a table, right? A view is something that is not saving your data, but it is just a macro for a larger query. So that is sometimes good, but it is also, if it is a large enough query, it might give you an overhead for recomputing all of your values for the views again and again. So the idea would be to update the summary table with the triggers, where anytime changes are made to account and loan, we update the summary table based on these changes. So we will talk about these things. Essentially, this concept is essentially called something as a materialized views. We'll talk about this next class, and then we will move on to the security question. I think it was Dennis's question that we have to talk about. So Dennis, next class we will also talk about your security questions. So firstly, we will discuss about materialized views and what is the difference between this and a simple view. And we will also talk about authentication and authorization. How can I make sure that a user has or does not have access to a database or table? Okay, let me stop recording.